Luke had been working on the freighter for weeks. The ship was old, worn out, and far from the busy trade routes. Still, it was a good job, and the crew were decent. The captain, a gruff man named Harold, kept things running smoothly, and the crew kept their heads down, doing their jobs. It was just another slow day when everything changed. Luke was in the cargo hold, his hands covered in grease as he worked on a malfunctioning engine panel. The hum of the ship was a constant reminder of the work that needed to be done, but Luke was used to it. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary today. Then he heard a sound, a quiet shuffle coming from behind one of the large crates. He froze, wiping his hands on a rag. At first he thought it was one of the crew, sneaking around the cargo hold, but the sound didn't match the usual footsteps of the freighter's workers. Luke crept closer, trying to be as quiet as possible. As he rounded the corner of a stack of crates, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, huddled against the wall, was a figure, a woman. Her skin had an unusual shade of blue, and her hair was silver, falling in loose waves around her face. But it was her eyes that drew Luke in. They were sharp, piercing, like she was always watching for danger, always ready to move. She wore a strange, heavily armored suit that looked more like a second skin than anything else. The armor was scratched and dented, but it still hummed with faint energy. The woman looked up at him, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Luke's heart raced. He had never seen anyone like her before, not in all the years he'd worked with aliens. "Who are you?" Luke asked cautiously, his voice low. The woman's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, fear maybe, in her eyes. She shifted slightly, clearly not wanting to reveal too much. But Luke wasn't afraid. He was more curious than anything else. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly, her voice oddly soothing despite the tension in the air. "Please, just help me." Luke didn't know what to think. Who was she? Why was she here? But the fact that she seemed so desperate told him she wasn't here to cause trouble. The suit she wore was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It looked alien, but there was something human about it too. Maybe it was just the way she carried herself, the way her eyes locked onto his as though she could trust him. "Why are you hiding here?" Luke asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The woman took a deep breath and then, reluctantly, began to speak. "I'm Alira," she said. "I'm running from my people. They want me dead." Luke's brow furrowed in confusion. "Running from your people, but why?" Alira hesitated for a moment, as though weighing how much she should reveal. She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously as though she expected someone to show up at any moment. Luke could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself, in such a defensive manner. "I didn't agree with what they're doing," she explained finally. "I couldn't be a part of the war they're waging, so I left. Now they want to make an example of me." Luke took a step closer, unsure of what to say. He had heard of wars among alien species before, but he had never been close to one. He had never been involved in anything like this. But there was something about Alira's story that felt real. He couldn't explain why, but he knew she wasn't lying. "Why come to us?" Luke asked. "Why come to a human freighter?" Alira's eyes softened slightly as if she were grateful for his understanding. "Humans, you're neutral in this. You're not involved. I thought maybe you'd help me." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had never been in a situation like this before. Helping an alien, an enemy of her people, was dangerous. If anyone found out, it could cost him everything. But there was something in Alira's eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't like the soldiers or mercenaries he had heard about. She was different, vulnerable. "I don't know if I can help you," Luke said honestly, but his voice was softer now, as he thought about the potential consequences. "But I can't just leave you here." Alira gave him a small, appreciative smile. It wasn't much, but it was Enough. She seemed to relax, her shoulders lowering slightly, as though the weight of her situation was just a little easier to bear with him there. "Thank you," she whispered. Just then, the comm system buzzed to life, breaking the moment. "Luke, where are you?" Captain Harold's voice echoed through the ship. "We need you in the control room. Get moving." Luke's stomach sank. The last thing he needed was the captain coming down here while he was with a mysterious alien woman. Quickly, he glanced at Alira, who seemed to sense his concern. She nodded once as though understanding the urgency of the situation. "Go," she whispered. "I'll be fine." Luke hesitated for a second longer before he turned and made his way to the control room. The last thing he saw before he left the cargo, "Hold," was Alira's tired face, watching him as he disappeared from view. In the control room, Captain Harold was waiting for him. "What took you so long?" the captain grunted. "We've got some trouble. I need you to check the engine readings. Something's off." Luke nodded, trying to keep his mind on the task at hand, but in the back of his mind, Alira's words echoed. "They want me dead." He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Luke spent the next few hours working on the ship's systems, trying to fix the small engine malfunction the captain had pointed out. But his mind kept drifting back to Alira. He couldn't help but wonder about her. Why had she chosen to hide? Here on their ship? Why was she running from her people? As he worked, he glanced up from time to time, keeping an eye on the doorway. He had been careful to lock the cargo hold behind him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone might discover Alira and everything would spiral out of control. After a while, Captain Harold returned to the control room. He seemed distracted, pacing the floor as he glanced at the ship's monitors. "We've got company," Harold said gruffly. "A freighter's been spotted near our route. It could be one of theirs. We need to move fast." Luke nodded, trying to stay focused. The last thing he needed was a battle right now. His hands moved mechanically as he checked the engine's power output. But in the back of his mind, his thoughts were still with Alira. "Captain, could you give me a few more minutes to make sure everything is solid?" Luke asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Harold shot him a quick, sharp glance. "Make it quick! We don't have time for delays. We've got enemies to outrun." As Harold turned to leave, Luke hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. He had to make sure Alira was safe before they took off. If her people found her, they would stop at nothing to capture her. "I'll be back," he muttered to himself. Luke quickly walked to the cargo hold, his mind racing. When he reached the door, he punched in the security code and stepped inside. The dim light inside the room seemed to pulse softly, casting long shadows across the walls. Alira was still there, sitting near the crates, her armor now more relaxed, but still giving off an aura of mystery and strength. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her eyes met his with a mix of wariness and curiosity. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an underlying tension. Luke nodded, forcing a smile. "We're getting ready to leave. I just wanted to check on you." Alira's brow furrowed slightly. "You shouldn't trust me, Luke. I could be a danger to you and your crew." Luke shook his head. "I don't believe that. You're not like the others. You wouldn't hurt anyone unless you had to." Alira's eyes softened at his words, but there was still doubt in her expression. "You don't know what I've done, what I've been through." Luke stepped closer, the urgency of the situation pressing against him. "You don't have to tell me everything. But I'm not going to leave you behind, Alira. I'm not going to let you be hunted." She looked down at the ground, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand. The consequences of helping me could be worse than you imagine." Before Luke could respond, the ship suddenly jolted. The lights flickered, and the sound of alarms blared through the corridors. "Everyone brace for impact!" Captain Harold's voice came over the ship's comm system. Luke's heart raced. He quickly turned to Alira. "Stay here. Don't move." He rushed out of the cargo hold and sprinted back to the control room. Captain Harold was already at the helm, his hands moving quickly over the controls as the ship's engines roared to life. "Get ready to jump to hyperspace," Harold barked. "We need to leave now." Luke slid into the seat beside him, trying to stay calm. "What's going on?" "We've got company," Harold muttered, his voice tense. "The freighter we saw earlier, it's closing in fast. It's one of theirs." Luke felt a cold chill run down his spine. The last thing he wanted was a fight. "What are we going to do?" "We run," Harold said, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the controls. "I'll try to outrun them. But if they catch up..." The ship suddenly rocked again, this time with more force. Alira's voice crackled over the comm system, causing both men to freeze. "Luke," Alira said urgently, "they're here." Luke's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How did they find us?" "They followed my signal." Alira's voice was filled with quiet regret. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't think they could track me this fast." Luke turned to Captain Harold. "We need to get her off this ship." Harold glanced at Luke with an unreadable expression. "She's not going anywhere unless we make a run for it. But we can't outrun them for long." Luke felt a surge of frustration. They were trapped. There was no easy way out. "Then we fight," Luke said, his voice steady. "We fight, and we protect her. I won't let them take her." Harold stared at him for a moment, his jaw clenched. "Fine. Get to the guns. We'll make them regret following us." Luke nodded quickly, his pulse racing as he turned to leave. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't know what kind of ship they were up against, but he couldn't let them take Alira. He had already made a promise to her, and he wasn't about to break it. He ran through the corridors, past the small crew quarters, and down into the lower decks. The ship's weapons were located in the rear, near the engine room. Luke slid into the weapons control seat, his hands already moving to bring the ship's laser cannons online. The controls lit up in front of him, showing the enemy ship's location. It was closing in fast. He could see the faint outline of the enemy ship in the distance, its engines glowing faintly in the dark space. "Ready," Luke muttered under his breath. Captain Harold's voice crackled over the comm. "Luke, I'm about to engage them. Hold on tight." The ship lurched again as Captain Harold engaged the thrusters, sending them into a sudden burst of speed. Luke gripped the controls tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as he aimed the ship's weapons. "Firing!" Luke said, his voice steady. A powerful blast shot out of the ship, hitting the enemy ship dead center. The explosion rocked their ship as the enemy vessel retaliated, firing back with its own lasers. Luke braced for impact, but the ship held strong despite the violent shaking. "We're not going down without a fight," Luke muttered, his hands moving quickly to adjust the targeting systems. Another blast hit, and the enemy ship seemed to stagger, its shields flickering. But the battle was far from over. Luke had no idea what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain. This fight would determine everything. The ship shook violently as the enemy fired another round of blasts. Luke's heart raced as he quickly adjusted the targeting system, trying to find a way to weaken the enemy ship's defenses. The ship rocked again, and he could feel the vibrations in his bones. "Captain, they're not backing off," Luke shouted, his voice tight with stress. Harold gripped the controls, his knuckles white from the pressure. "Keep firing, Luke. We need to punch through their shields before they disable us." Luke didn't need any further instruction. He aimed the ship's cannons once again and fired a powerful blast. The laser shot through space, striking the enemy ship's shields. The enemy ship staggered slightly, and Luke saw the faint flicker of their shields weakening. But before they could follow up, the enemy retaliated, their weapons firing relentlessly. "We're taking damage," Harold yelled over, the loud sounds of the ship's alarms. "We need to get to a safe position. I'm making a jump to another quadrant. Prepare for a sudden jump, Luke." Luke's stomach churned as the ship lurched again, but this time it wasn't from enemy fire. The ship's engines roared to life, sending them into a sharp turn. He quickly recalibrated the firing system while keeping an eye on the enemy ship. They were in the thick of it now. They needed to find a way to escape, but Luke wasn't ready to give up yet. Alira's face flashed through his mind. She was counting on him. "Captain, there's a blind spot. I can target it if you can give me another few seconds," Luke said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Harold's eyes narrowed as he glanced at Luke. "Do it, but be quick. I'm not sure how long we can keep this up." Luke adjusted the targeting systems and fired again. This time, the blast hit the blind spot perfectly, causing the enemy ship's shields to flicker out completely. Without their shields, the enemy ship was vulnerable. "Now!" Luke shouted. Harold wasted no time. He fired their weapons, and this time, the blast struck directly into the hull of the enemy ship. There was a loud explosion, and the enemy ship seemed to falter before it began drifting slowly. "We've got them," Luke said, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. Harold didn't look as relaxed. "Don't celebrate too soon. We might have knocked them down, but there are more out there. We need to keep moving." Luke nodded, quickly scanning the surrounding space. But before they could make another move, their ship shook violently again, and a warning light flashed in front of them. "We've got incoming!" Harold shouted, his voice more urgent now. Luke's eyes widened. More enemy ships were appearing from all directions. He could see their shadowy outlines moving through space, their weapons charging up for another round of fire. "Get us out of here, Captain!" Luke yelled, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the ship's controls. Harold was already on it, his focus intense. "I'm trying! Hold on!" The ship shook again, and Luke's heart dropped. The enemy was closing in fast, and they were outgunned. Luke could feel the weight of the situation settling in. They had to escape, and they had to do it now. Just then, a new voice came through the comm system. It was Alira. "Luke," her voice was steady, but Luke could hear the tension behind it. "They've found us. We have no time. You need to get me out of here. If they catch me, they'll destroy everything you've worked for." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped they could escape before they reached this point. But now it was clear. The fight wasn't just about them escaping anymore. It was about protecting Alira at all costs. "Alira," Luke said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising panic in his chest. "We're not leaving you behind. I'll figure something out. Just stay hidden." Alira's voice came through again, clearer. This time, "You don't have much time. They've already locked onto your ship. You're running out of options." Luke felt the weight of her words sink in. They couldn't just keep running. They needed to stand their ground, and that meant using everything. They had left. "Captain," Luke said, turning to Harold with a new determination in his voice, "we need to fight them off. We need to disable their ships and make a clean getaway." Harold didn't hesitate. "Agreed. We've got one shot at this. Let's make it count." Luke quickly mapped out the positions of the enemy ships on the control panel. There were too many, but with a little creativity, he could help Harold target the right ship. He adjusted the weapon systems and aimed for the most vulnerable target. "On my mark, Captain," Luke said, his fingers hovering over the controls. Harold's hands moved swiftly as he prepared for the final strike. "I'm ready. You give the order." "Now!" Luke shouted. Harold fired, and the ship's weapons lit up the void of space. The blast hit one of the enemy ships, causing it to break apart, its debris floating in the emptiness. But before they could celebrate their victory, the remaining ships closed in, determined to finish the fight. "We've got to make it to the jump gate," Harold said through clenched teeth. "Hold on!" The ship shot forward, and the stars stretched into lines as they accelerated. Luke's stomach lurched as they made the jump, entering hyperspace just in time to escape the remaining enemy ships. For a moment, there was only the hum of the ship's engines and the quiet of the empty space around them. Luke leaned back in, his seat, exhaling a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We're safe," Luke said softly, glancing at Harold, who let out a relieved sigh. "For now," Harold muttered. "But we can't stay in one place for too long. We've got..." To keep moving? Luke nodded. He knew the danger wasn't over. They had escaped the immediate threat, but the war Alira had fled from was far from finished. He turned to the comm system, his mind already on their next steps. Alira, we've made it through for now, but we need to keep moving. Stay close. We'll find a way to keep you safe, Luke said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Alira's voice came back through the comm, stronger than before. Thank you, Luke. You don't know what this means to me. Luke sat back, his eyes focused on the endless stretch of stars ahead. They had won this round, but the road ahead was uncertain. One thing was clear. He would protect Alira, no matter what came next. The air in the clearing was thick with tension as Matt and Arena caught their breath. The dense forest behind them seemed alive with strange noises, but the clearing ahead was calm. Matt couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as they stepped into the open space. They had survived the first challenge, but they both knew there were more obstacles ahead. We did it, Matt said, looking at Arena with a small, exhausted smile. Arena didn't return his smile, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. We did, but the real challenge is still to come. We've just crossed the first part. There's more waiting. Matt nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The creatures of the forest had been terrifying, but now they were in open ground, and the feeling of being exposed made Matt uneasy. The large stone archway they had seen in the distance seemed even farther away now. It was still a long way. To go! Suddenly a loud noise pierced the silence, a low rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Matt turned to Arena, who had already drawn her blade. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings. They're here, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt's heart began to race. He felt a wave of anxiety hit him. Who were they? He looked around but saw nothing. The clearing was wide, and the trees behind them stood silent. Yet he felt something, a presence, an unseen threat moving closer. Without warning, shadows moved across the ground, and Matt saw figures dart between the trees. He couldn't make out their details, but they were fast, too fast. The sound of feet pounding against the earth grew louder. They were being surrounded. Stay close to me, Arena said, her tone steady but urgent. Before Matt could respond, the first of the enemies appeared. A group of humanoid figures, their faces hidden behind dark masks, emerged from the shadows. Their bodies were clad in black armor, sleek and deadly. They moved with precision, their eyes glowing faintly beneath their helmets. Matt instinctively stepped back, but Arena didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her energy blade flashing in the light. The first enemy raised their weapon, a sharp, glowing spear. But Arena was faster. She sidestepped the attack and sliced through the enemy's weapon with one clean swipe. The enemy staggered back, their helmet cracking as they fell to the ground. The others moved quickly, surrounding them. On all sides, Matt could see the glint of their weapons, and his body tensed. There were more of them than he had expected, and they didn't look like they were going to show mercy. Arena didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her stance firm and ready. Stay. Behind me, she told Matt again, her voice calm even in the face of danger. Matt didn't argue. He had seen how skilled she was in the forest, and he trusted her. But he wasn't about to stand there and do nothing. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, using it as a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The enemies charged, and the air filled with the sound of clashing metal. Arena fought with deadly grace, her energy blade cutting through the air with a hum. She moved like water, flowing around her enemies, striking with precision. Matt couldn't keep up with her speed, but he did his best to stay close and keep the enemies at bay. The first two enemies fell quickly, their bodies dropping to the ground with a thud, but the others were faster, smarter. They worked as a team, flanking Arena and Matt on both sides. One enemy swung their weapon at Matt, forcing him to dodge. He barely managed to avoid the strike, but his heart pounded in his chest. He was used to running missions, But this was unlike anything he had ever faced. A spear shot past him, narrowly missing his arm. Matt swung his branch at the enemy, striking them in the chest. The blow wasn't enough to stop them, but it bought him a few precious seconds. He backed away, his mind racing. He needed a plan, and fast. Irina was still fighting, her energy blade flashing as she parried and attacked with swift, controlled movements. She took down another enemy with a swift slice, but there were still too many. Matt's pulse quickened as he realized how close they were to being overwhelmed. "We need to get to the archway," Irina shouted over her shoulder, her voice sharp. "We can't stay here." Matt didn't argue. He had no idea what would happen if they were caught, but he wasn't about to find out. They had to keep moving. He swung his branch at an oncoming enemy, knocking their spear aside. Irina fought her way through the remaining enemies, her movements fluid and graceful. But they were getting closer, and there was no time to waste. They fought their way toward the stone archway, the sounds of battle ringing in their ears. The enemies were relentless, but Irina was faster. With one last powerful swing of her blade, she took down another opponent, clearing the way for Matt to follow her. "Go!" she yelled, pushing him toward the archway. Matt didn't hesitate. He ran as fast as he could, his legs burning with exhaustion. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, but he refused to look back. He had to get to the archway. It was their only chance. Irina was close behind him, her blade still glowing brightly. The enemies were catching up, but they couldn't slow down now. The archway was within reach. Finally, they reached the archway. Matt could see the faint outline of the grand hall beyond, the light shining through the stone. But as they passed through the archway, the ground beneath them suddenly shook. A loud roar echoed in the distance. Matt and Irina froze, their hearts racing. This was far from over. The trial had just begun, and there was more danger ahead. Matt and Irina emerged from the archway into a wide stone hall. The grand chamber stretched far before them, and the stone walls glowed faintly, illuminating their path. The air felt different here, heavier, as if the very space they were in carried a weight of secrets. Irina moved quietly, her eyes sharp and observant. Matt followed closely behind, his heart still racing from the battle. Though they had made it through the clearing, Matt knew that the true test was only beginning. The challenges were far from over. "This is the second part of the trial," Irina said softly, her voice low. "But it is not what you think." Matt glanced around, puzzled. They had passed through so many different trials already, and now they were in a new place. What was this hidden chamber? He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was waiting for them. They continued walking through the hall, its walls lined with strange carvings and symbols that Matt couldn't understand. The designs seemed ancient, perhaps older than any civilization he had ever known. Irina stopped before a large stone door at the end of the hall. She placed her hand against it, and the door slowly began to open with a low, grinding noise. The light from the chamber poured in, revealing what lay beyond. Inside was a vast room, filled with ancient artifacts and pieces of technology that seemed far beyond anything Matt had ever seen. At the center of the room stood a large pedestal, covered in dust, with strange glowing crystals arranged in a circle around it. The air in this room was thick with the weight of history, and Matt couldn't help but feel that they had just entered a place that was never meant to be found. "This is where the true challenge begins," Irina said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "My ancestors built this chamber to test those who would lead our people. It is said to hold the knowledge of our past, our greatest strengths and our deepest secrets. The trial here is not about power. It is about understanding." Matt stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. "What do we need to do?" Irina walked toward the pedestal, her movements careful. "We must unlock the knowledge hidden in this room. To do so, we must solve the riddle of the crystals. These crystals are the key." Matt looked at the glowing crystals, each one flickering, with a strange light. He could feel their energy, pulsing gently in the air. They weren't like anything he had ever encountered before, and he didn't understand how they worked. Irina approached the pedestal and knelt before it. She closed her eyes, her fingers lightly brushing the crystals. "Each of these crystals represents a different aspect of my people's history," she explained. "One represents wisdom, one represents power, one represents courage, and one represents sacrifice. To unlock the chamber, we must align them in the right order." Matt watched her carefully. "And how do we know the right order?" Irina opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "We don't. The answer comes from within. The crystals react to the heart of the person who touches them. They will show us the way, but we must be true to ourselves." Matt stood silently for a moment, processing what she had said. This wasn't just a physical challenge. It wasn't about strength or combat. It was about understanding something deeper, something that connected Irina's people with the core of who they were. He stepped forward, joining her by the pedestal. The crystals were glowing softly now, the air around them humming with energy. Matt reached out and touched the closest one, the crystal flickering as his fingers made contact. The moment his hand touched the crystal, the room seemed to change. The walls around them began to shift, and the symbols on the stone walls started to glow brightly. Images flashed in Matt's mind, visions of battles, of kings and queens long forgotten, of the rise and fall of civilizations. He saw moments of strength and of failure, of wisdom shared and wisdom lost. The crystal in front of him pulsed with light, and Matt could feel something, an energy, a connection to the past, flowing through him. It was as if the knowledge of the entire galaxy had been condensed into this one moment. He let go of the crystal and stepped back, his mind still racing with what he had seen. Irina stood silently beside him, her eyes closed in deep concentration. "The first one is wisdom," Irina said softly, her voice filled with reverence. "It was the foundation of our people, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to negotiate, the wisdom to understand our place in the universe." Matt nodded, understanding now. This wasn't just about following orders or completing challenges. It was about understanding the choices of the past and learning from them. He had learned that through the visions the crystal had shown him. Irina reached out and touched the second crystal. This one flickered with a dark energy, its light intense and powerful. Matt could feel the weight of it, the raw force it contained. He stepped back, allowing Irina to take control. "This one represents power," Irina said, her voice steady. "The power to protect, to lead, and to shape the future. But it is also the power that can destroy, that can turn against us if we do not control it." The crystal responded to her touch, its light pulsing with a bright, blinding glow. The room shook slightly, and Matt could feel the power building around them. He knew that this crystal was not just a symbol of strength. It was a reminder of the dangers that came with it. Irina moved on to the third crystal, this one glowing with a softer light, but it still carried a sense of urgency. She touched it, gently, and Matt watched as the energy within the crystal shifted. "This one represents courage," Irina said, her voice quiet but firm. "The courage to face the unknown, to stand up for what is right, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The crystal flared to life, its light bathing the room in a warm glow. Matt could feel the courage it embodied, the drive to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. It was a power that resonated deeply within him, and he understood that this was the spirit of a true leader. Finally, Irina reached for the last crystal. This one was the darkest of them all, its surface cold and distant. When her hand touched it, the room fell silent. The air grew still, and the light from the other crystals seemed to fade into the background. "This one is sacrifice," Arena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The greatest of all, the willingness to give up everything for the greater good, the courage to face loss and to rise above it." The crystal began to glow, but its light was faint, as though it was reluctant to reveal its truth. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final moment. Matt watched as Arena closed her eyes, her hand resting on the crystal. He could feel her resolve, the strength in her choice. She was willing to give everything for this trial, for her people, and for their future. The crystals all flared to life, their lights converging into one final burst of energy. The pedestal shook, and the chamber was filled with a blinding light. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the light faded. The chamber was silent again. The crystals were still glowing softly, and Matt could feel the power they held. But the trial was far from over. They had passed one test, but there would be more to come. Arena turned to him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We have unlocked the knowledge of our people," she said quietly. "But now we must face the final challenge." The light from the crystals faded, and the chamber was once again plunged into quiet darkness. Matt and Arena stood still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The final challenge had begun, but neither of them knew exactly what it would entail. They had unlocked the knowledge of the ancient trial, but that was just one part of their journey. "Are you ready?" Arena asked, her voice soft but filled with determination. Matt nodded, though his heart was racing. He had no idea what awaited them, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Arena face whatever was ahead alone. They had made it this far, and together they could face anything. The chamber trembled beneath their feet, and a low hum filled the air. A door hidden in the far corner of the room slowly creaked open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The walls of the passage were lined with strange symbols, similar to those that had been on the stones of the previous challenges. It was as though they were being led to something, but what? Arena stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her energy blade. Matt followed closely behind, his senses alert. Whatever the test was, it was clear that it wouldn't be easy, but they had made it this far, and now there was no turning back. The passage was narrow, the air thick with tension. As they walked deeper into the corridor, the sounds of the chamber began to fade, replaced by a strange echo, as though they were walking through the heart of the world itself. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the glowing symbols casting strange shadows that danced in the dark. Matt's heart was in his throat as they moved forward. The weight of the trial pressed heavily on him. They had faced the forest, survived the creatures, and unlocked the chamber's secrets, but none of that seemed to matter now. This final test would be different. Ahead of them, the corridor opened, up into a vast chamber. It was unlike anything Matt had ever seen. The floor was covered in smooth stone, but the walls were lined with dark, ancient tapestries, each one depicting scenes of battles, sacrifice, and ancient rulers. The air was cold, and the room felt empty, as if it had not been touched for centuries. At the center of the chamber stood a large, glowing pedestal, much like the one from before. But this time, there was no orb or crystal. Instead, the pedestal was empty, as though waiting for something. "This is it," Arena said, her voice steady but filled with a sense of purpose. "The final test." Matt looked around the room, trying to make sense of it all. There was no obvious challenge, no creature to fight or puzzle to solve. The chamber was quiet, still, but he could feel the weight of the moment. This was the end, and whatever happened here would determine their fate. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to shake. The pedestal lit up, its glow intensifying as the room grew darker. A low, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down Matt's spine. "Only those worthy may pass," the voice boomed, resonating through the stone walls. "The final test is not one of strength, nor wisdom, nor courage. It is a test of heart. You must face your greatest fear, your deepest regret, and make a choice. Only by choosing wisely can you succeed." Matt's stomach twisted. A test of heart? What did that even mean? He had already faced so many challenges, but none like this. He had never been forced to confront his own fears, his own regrets. How could he face something like that? Irina stepped forward, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She seemed unaffected by the voice, but Matt could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the hilt of her blade. She was ready for whatever came next. But Matt wasn't so sure. The floor rumbled again, and the pedestal began to glow brighter. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls narrowing as though the chamber itself was coming alive. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind whipped through the room, carrying with it the faint whispers of long-forgotten voices. "Matt," Irina said quietly, her voice calm despite the storm building around them. "You must face your fear. Whatever it is, you must confront it. Only then will we pass." He nodded, his hands clenched into fists. But inside he was terrified. He didn't know what his greatest fear was, but he could feel it. Something lurking, waiting to be uncovered. It was as if the chamber was reaching into his soul, pulling out the darkest parts of him. The rumbling grew louder, and suddenly the air seemed to shimmer. Matt's vision blurred, and he was no longer standing in the chamber. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark. The world around him was cold, and he was alone. A feeling of dread washed over him. A figure appeared before him, shrouded in darkness. The figure was tall, its face hidden by a hood. But Matt knew who it was. It was his father, standing before him with a cold, distant gaze. "You failed me," the figure said, its voice a harsh whisper. "You always fail. You could never live up to the expectations I set for you." Matt felt his chest tighten. He had never forgiven himself for the failure he felt he had caused. The guilt had always been there, buried deep inside him. It was the reason he had joined the military in the first place, to prove he wasn't weak, to prove he could do something that mattered. But now, in this moment, the guilt was all-consuming. It felt like he was trapped in his own regret, suffocating beneath the weight of it. "You're not good enough," the figure continued, its voice filled with anger. "You never will be." Matt wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. The figure was closing in on him, the darkness pressing in tighter. He could feel the weight of the words, the shame, the regret that had haunted him for years. But then, through the darkness, a voice broke through. "Matt," Irina's voice called, soft and steady. "You are enough. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to choose who you want to be." Matt looked up, and for the first time he saw Irina standing beside him. Her presence was like a light in the darkness, strong and unwavering. She wasn't afraid, and in that moment, Matt realized that he didn't have to be either. The figure before him began to fade, the darkness receding as he stepped forward. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his past lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't defined by his mistakes, by the failures that had haunted him. He was defined by his choices. He made his choice. He stepped away from the darkness into the light, and the room responded, the pedestal glowing brighter as the chamber began to calm. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Matt stood still, his mind still racing from the vision he had just experienced. His deepest fears and regrets had been laid bare before him, and yet he had chosen to step away from them. The darkness had receded, but the weight of the moment still hung heavy on his shoulders. Irina stood beside him, her eyes calm, though there was a quiet understanding in them. She had faced her own challenges in this trial, but Matt could see that her journey wasn't over yet either. The final test had only just begun, and now it was time to face the consequences of their choices. For a long moment, nothing happened. The pedestal was still glowing, but there were no more whispers, no more voices. The chamber was still, as though holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Matt took a deep breath, looking around the room. The dark walls, the strange symbols, the air that still seemed to hum with energy. They were all part of something much bigger than him. He had made it this far, but now he had to prove that his choices were worth it. He wasn't just here for himself. He was here for something greater. Irina spoke first, her voice steady but full of resolve. "We have made it through the trial, Matt. But there is one final choice to make. This trial was not just about strength or wisdom. It was about understanding who we are and what we are willing to fight for." Matt turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do we have to do now?" "The final choice is not mine to make," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It's yours." Matt looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The trial is over," Irina explained. "But you have a choice to make. The chamber will only open once you choose what you want to carry with you. This is not just a choice for survival. It is a choice for the future." The air around them began to shift again. The pedestal in the center of the room began to glow even brighter, its light intensifying. The chamber seemed to stretch and grow as if the space itself was shifting, expanding to reveal something new. A low hum filled the air, the ground beneath, their feet vibrating. A vision appeared before Matt, an image of the galaxy, filled with stars, planets, and distant civilizations. He could see the future stretching out before him, the choices he had made leading to different paths, each one filled with its own consequences. "You have proven your strength, Matt," the voice from earlier echoed once more, deep and resonant. "Now you must choose the path you will walk. Will you remain here as a leader of your people, guiding them to a future of unity and peace? Or will you return to your world, carrying with you the lessons you have learned, shaping your destiny and the future of humanity?" The choice lay before him, clearer than ever. Matt's heart raced as he considered the possibilities. The future of humanity, the future of his people, was in his hands. He had seen the consequences of his choices, the weight of his actions, and now he had to decide. Irina stood beside him, her presence steady. She had already faced her own choices. She had already walked the path of leadership, of sacrifice, and now it was his turn to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. "You are not alone, Matt," Irina said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "The path you choose may be difficult, but you have the strength to walk it. You have already proven that." Matt looked around at the vision before him, the galaxy, the stars, the unknown future. He could feel the weight of it all, the responsibility, the uncertainty. But he also felt something else, the power of his choices. He had faced his fears, his regrets, and now he had to step into the unknown. "I choose the future," Matt said, his voice steady. "I choose to walk the path that leads to a better world. I choose to carry the lessons of this trial with me, to build something new, something strong." The moment he spoke, the pedestal flared with light, the entire chamber shaking as if the very foundation of the world was shifting. The stars in the vision before him began to align, their light growing brighter, clearer. The path ahead was illuminated, and Matt could see the future stretching out before him. A soft sound echoed through the chamber, and the ground beneath their feet began to stabilize. The chamber's walls, once dark and oppressive, now seemed to glow with a soft light, the symbols fading into the background. The trial was over. Irina turned to him, her eyes filled with pride. "You have made your choice, Matt, and now you will shape the future. Matt smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had made the right choice, not just for himself, but for humanity. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, struggles, and sacrifices. But he was ready. He was ready to face whatever the future held. As the chamber began to open, revealing the bright light of the outside world, Matt stepped forward, his heart filled with hope. He had chosen his path, and now he would walk it. Together, Matt and Irina stepped out into the light, leaving behind the darkness of the trial. The world beyond awaited them, filled with endless possibilities. They had faced the trial, and they had emerged stronger for it. The future was theirs to shape.